Yes, I am an Iron Maiden fan, although it may not look like it. I promise you I had hair down to my waist up until I was about 21, but I think it was a good professional decision to cut it. However, I still miss headbanging when I go to the odd concert these days. One thing that Trina didn't mention was that I'm notoriously bad at taking selfies. This is me on stage at an IBM symposium in front of 450 people. And then this is me on stage just a couple of months ago at the demo day for our village Experience Accelerator program. So I'm going to take the liberty to try again. So what I would ask you to do is just put your hands in the air. I'm going to share this on Twitter later. Whether or not it succeeds or fails is beside the point. It's probably going to fail. Hands in the air, let's do this. Woo! Actually turned out pretty good. Thank you very much for your cooperation. So human beings, we love a lot of things, right? Some of which I'm not going to share on this stage. But then there's things we don't love. Other than our selfies not working out, we don't like ambiguity, we don't like not knowing for sure, and we definitely don't like making decisions without all of the information. We love certainty. We love it when things grow in a predictable manner, kind of like this strawberry. But today's environment is far from predictable. Seems like just yesterday we were listening to music on an Apple iPod Classic. Who had one of these? Yeah, pretty much about 60% of the room. But today you're far more likely to be listening to music on your smartphone via Spotify instead of an iPod via iTunes. And some of you are probably getting home from the office and saying, hey Google, play that song from The Breakfast Club. And what's it going to play? Someone's like, Simple Minds? So it'll play Don't You Forget About Me from the Simple Minds. Or maybe you're in the mood for a little bit of Rocky. That's an easier one. I have the tiger, thank you very much. However, hopefully Google Home gets intelligent enough that it knows that you're a hardcore Rocky fan, and so when you say play that song from Rocky, it plays No Easy Way Out from Rocky IV, which was clearly the best song in the franchise. So the time between disruptive innovations is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And this is being driven by Moore's Law, which Anthony pointed out earlier, exponential technology growth. But let's just take a quick second to put that into perspective. There's a great tale of the Indian emperor asking the inventor of chess to name his reward for coming up with the game. And the inventor said, look, I'm a simple man. All I want is 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, doubled with each square thereafter. Sure enough, by the 64th square, the inventor had earned himself 9 quintillion grains of rice, which is enough to cover the entire country of India with 50-kilogram bags of rice. That's what we're dealing with when we talk exponential growth. And this isn't a new phenomenon. Technology has been advancing or doubling every 18 months for over 50 years. And so we're now sitting at the cusp of the upheaval of almost everything we know. Not just in a business sense, but also in life. Tara mentioned earlier that we're already augmented humans. We've just got a physical disconnect between the device and the way we choose to process it, or the way we process it. But for many of us sitting in the room, it might feel a little bit more like this. And this is because our organizations have been built, or this is because our organizations are using old maps to navigate what is effectively a new world. It's kind of like the time that Nelson Martin, Milhouse, and Bart, there you go, armed with nothing but a 1982 AA guidebook, a rental car, and a fake ID, made their way to the World Fair. Now, there was one problem with this. It was 1998, and the World Fair had long since shut down. Such is life when you try to navigate a new world with old maps. So what happens when you update your maps? Well, case in point, China. In 1990, China's gross national product was about $1 trillion US. But after Deng Xiaoping liberated the Chinese economy, their gross national product increased by a factor of more than 20 in the past 25 years. In fact, it surpassed the United States in 2014. That's what happens when you update your maps to navigate the new world you find yourself in. So how do some of these old maps show up in the workplace? Well, Dan mentioned earlier that a lot of the values, processes, and metrics we use in our organizations today help us deliver upon an existing business model, not to find new ones. So some of the values, such as talking instead of doing, which we saw in the IBM video that Scott showed, top-down decision-making, prioritizing features instead of simplicity, being closed instead of open to collaboration, siloed, product first instead of prototype, doing it later instead of now, and outsourcing accountability rather than taking ownership. Now, these are some of the values that may serve a purpose, and I'll get to that later, but when it comes to innovation, they hold us back. And when it comes to processes and metrics, things like business cases, performance demands, time to break even, so a metric we often find in business cases, procurement processes, brand parameters, steering committees, and annual or biannual performance reviews instead of ongoing reviews and absolute transparency. Now, we've got things up there like brand parameters. Now, you might want to move as fast as possible, but your marketing team may not let you do that because every single piece of collateral that leaves the building needs to conform with a particular structure and brand parameters. And if it doesn't, then it needs to go back for review, and then you wait a week or two for that review. And if you're always waiting for somebody else's approval to do anything, you're not going to be moving anywhere near as fast as you need to innovate. Speed is absolutely fundamental to success when it comes to innovation. Now, these processes, metrics, values, they're not all bad. In fact, they serve a purpose. They serve a purpose which is to deliver upon an existing repeatable business model, kind of like this assembly line up on the screen. Now, the problem with that is it doesn't help us to discover new business models, new ways of doing things, new technologies. And ultimately, it leads to few big bets taken slowly, cost blowouts, schedule blowouts, limited benefits realization. In fact, benefits realization often becomes an afterthought. We become so focused on delivering the thing and we lose touch of why we built the thing to begin with. What was the underlying why or purpose behind the product or service we've developed? We have unfulfilled employees. And as Trina mentioned at the start of the talk, my mission is to help unlock that latent potential of people within large organizations. Because I spent almost 10 years in firms where I felt like I was just a person playing a role in a box, and I had so much more to contribute, but unfortunately, the organization was built around these old world processes, values, and systems, which ultimately kept people who were talented and had the desire to create and contribute down. It's about unlocking that latent potential, and just on getting buy-in, that whole point, unfulfilled employees and high employee churn, it can cost anywhere between $40,000 and $70,000 when you lose an employee because of the onboarding cost, the training, the cost of lost productivity, and so on. And so when you're trying to get buy-in from decision makers in your organization, you can always play that card amongst many others when it comes to how do you quantify the cost of not innovating. Because I think it was Anthony who mentioned earlier that 70% of people don't even want to work for your established organizations. They want to work for startups, they want to do their own thing. But if you can empower them to do their own thing within a large organization, then you can create the dynamics that support innovation. Now, all of these things ultimately lead to big, hairy, audacious failures, or BHAFs, which is ultimately a play on words from big, hairy, audacious goals, made famous by Jim Collins in Good to Great. Now, here's some BHAFs that could have been avoided. New Coke, the Segway, Harley-Davidson cologne, because everybody wants to smell like a motorbike, and Lifesavers soda, because everybody wants to drink candy. So what does updating your maps look like in a large organization? Well, it's not as easy as simply throwing some beanbags around the office, introducing a ping pong table or a foosball table, and then covering your walls with Post-it notes. It's also not as easy as simply setting up an idea challenge, which more often than not becomes a glorified suggestion box. Now, the problem with the way we funnel ideas down our organizations from inception through to development is that we often ask this question: show me the ROI. And it may not necessarily be the ROI, but it could be the internal rate of return, It could be the net present value. We have things like payback period, which I talked about earlier. And this is akin to foreseeing the future, which Dan mentioned earlier. I foresee an ROI of 5x in 5 years for this totally new, untested idea. When we're dealing with disruptive innovation, we're dealing with what we can't see, not what we can see. We're dealing with heaps of untested assumptions. And so it's impossible to determine what the ROI is going to be when you don't know what the customer segment is, the distribution channel, the revenue model, the features you need to develop. None of that is answered. Yet we're projecting what the ROI is going to be in, say, 7 years. Doesn't make any sense. Contrast that with venture capitalists. Your typical VC firm invests in 20 startups a year. However, they track between 6,000 and 9,000, of which they meet with 2,000. Like I said, they invest in 20, and of those 20, 2 are what you would classify as home runs. That's innovation at scale. Yet when you invest in a corporate context, this is what it seems like corporate innovation investment managers think. We expect every investment to be successful. But disruptive innovation doesn't work that way. When you're dealing with Horizon 1 incremental innovation, you can be successful more often than not. But when you're dealing with Horizon 3 disruptive innovation, which is fraught with uncertainty, risk, untested assumptions, you need to have a very wide funnel. Otherwise, you're going into the ring with all the confidence and swagger of Apollo Creed as he comes face to face with the Soviet Union's Ivan Drago. And we all know how that story ended. At least I hope you do. If you haven't, you should definitely watch Rocky IV. So, what's the alternative? Well, I thought long and hard about this question, and unfortunately, I couldn't think up a solution, so I got a picture of a monkey for you. Now, I look at this monkey when I'm feeling bad, and it cheers me right up. Of course, I'm kidding. Not about the monkey cheering me up, about there not being an alternative. Now, this is how we currently approach innovation in a large company. We have an idea. If we get through the business case process, here's a big bag of money, and we're enabling a big, hairy, audacious failure. Now, that's not the way to do it. The way to go about it is to look at the product development lifecycle and provide metered funding. Validate the problem, validate the solution, validate the business model, then the features. And with each stage, you get a little bit of funding. Here's an example from an insurance company that we've worked with, who identified a number of problems they wanted to test and a number of customer segments. So the problem we're going to test is that people don't have time to work out. And here's one wind tunnel, as Scott put it, that you can use to test or to try and fly a kite. Firstly, we've targeted hospitality workers through Facebook, through customer segmentation on Facebook. And we're testing the problem in the ad copy. No time to look after yourself, this is what we do. And what we're trying to test here is how many people actually click the link who are from the hospitality industry. Our actual testing results, 140,000 impressions in 2 weeks, 1,400 clicks. As you can see, blue-collar workers got an acquisition rate of 3.17%, which was way more than the others. In this case, for $1,400 in 2 weeks, we managed to validate the problem with a little bit of funding. And then we move to the next stage, which is the solution. We've again got a number of potential solutions, and the one we're going to test is that we've got an all-in-one app with info on diet, exercise, and mindfulness. Okay, let's test whether or not that resonates with people. So people who clicked on the ad will then see a tailored landing page in this case, where they find out a little bit more about the product, and if they're interested, they click Get Early Access. Again, our actual testing results. Of the 1,400 people who landed on that website, we've got 50 signups, and blue-collar workers got a sign-up rate of 7.4%, which was way more than the other customer segments. In fact, that is a very strong activation rate for any online organization. So validate the solution, and then you want to validate the business model. How will you make money? And in this case, I'm going to introduce a classic case study, which is Buffer. Buffer is a social media scheduling tool where you basically set up what tweets and posts you want for the week, or the month, or the year even, and Buffer does the rest. Now, there's a lot of tools like this today, but when Buffer came along, they were the only one. And they wanted to test whether or not the problem was big enough that people would actually pay for it. So they set up a one-page website. The first screen basically told you what it did, and if you're interested, you click on the little green button, which would bring up the plans and pricing. For $5 a day, you'd get 10 tweets. For $20, for $5 a month rather. For $20 a month, you get unlimited tweets. Now, if you clicked on one of those, a pop-up box appeared which said, hey, you caught us before we're ready, but leave your email address and we'll let you know when we are. Within just 4 weeks, does anyone want to guess how many email addresses they collected? 20,000? Good guess. 10,000 in 4 weeks. Now, these are people that clicked $5 or $20. So clearly, the business model in this case was valid. So by spending little more than, say, $2,000 in a couple of weeks, you're able to go through this funnel, validate problem, validate solution, validate business model, and scale. However, I'm not saying that this is the be-all, end-all. However, by taking this approach, you're far less likely to be setting yourself up for big, hairy, audacious failures. Now, once you've gone through that whole process, you save the princess and live happily ever after. Now, I wanted to close out with a story, which brings home what I'm talking about here. And this story comes from the Korean War. Now, during the Korean War, the American pilots flew F-86 jets, whereas the Koreans flew Soviet-issue MiGs. Now, on paper, the MiGs were far superior to the F-86s, except there were two fundamental differences. And no, those differences were not Maverick and Iceman. Those differences were, 1, 360-degree vision. Unlike the Russian MiG, the F-86 had vision all the way around, so the pilots could see what was coming from every direction. And the second fundamental difference was a fully hydraulic throttle in the F-86, whereas the Russian MiG had a semi-hydraulic throttle, which meant that the Korean fighter pilots had to actually work out just so they could pull the throttle back all the way. Now, what did this do for the Americans? Well, it gave them a distinct advantage. It meant that they could observe, orient, decide, and act faster. Or they had a very short OODA loop, a term that comes out of the US military. And they were able to get inside their competitors' OODA loop. And when all was said and done, the Americans won the battle in the skies 10-1 with what were supposedly inferior planes. So by taking this approach to innovation in your organization, not only are you decreasing your own OODA loop, but you're supporting innovation at scale because you're empowering everyone in the company with an idea to test that idea. And by empowering everybody in your organization to test ideas and become comfortable with concepts like rapid prototyping, customer segmentation, and a lot of the different things that I've touched on in my talk, you're then also supporting culture change. But by taking this approach, you're less likely to experience a big, hairy, audacious failure, and you're far more likely to double down on opportunities worth pursuing. Thank you very much.